I want to thank you all for having me, and also I commend you for being indoors. It's really beautiful out here, and it was awesome getting here, although they did play the King's Speech on my flight over. I don't know who voted for that movie, but it was a good movie. But I wanted to talk a little bit about how I got to Facebook and how I got to the story of Facebook. I never set out to be a nonfiction writer. Nonfiction was never that interesting to me. I loved television, especially really bad TV. And I used to just sit at home and watch television, and so my parents installed a rule at home when I was a kid that we had to read 2 books a week before we were allowed to watch TV. So I became a speed reader so that I could watch TV. And when I graduated from college, I decided I wanted to be a writer, so I locked myself in a room in Boston where I live, and I wrote 9 novels, and they were really crappy, and they were deep, dark stories that took place in bars in New York City, because that's what I thought writers wrote. And consequently, I was rejected by everyone in publishing. I got about 190 rejection slips, and I had them all over my walls. I was even rejected by a janitor at a publishing house because I sent to an editor who no longer worked there, and the janitor pulled it out of the garbage can and read it and then rejected me. So it shows you how well I was writing. And finally, an editor took pity on me, and he said, "Why don't you try to write a thriller?" So I went home, I read John Grisham, I read Michael Crichton and Robert Ludlum, and I thought I could do this. And this was the dawn of ER and the medical thriller. So I wrote a medical thriller. My dad's a doctor, and he helped me with the information. And it was a book called Threshold, and don't worry, none of you have ever heard of it, because it sold like 3 copies. I got a second book, and it was called Reaper, and again, none of you have ever heard of it. And it was about an evil scientist who implanted a computer virus, and it became a biological virus, and people started getting sick from their television sets. And I came up with the idea after watching a really bad episode of Oprah. That became a TV movie. It was called Fatal Error, which still airs at 2 in the morning. Really bad. It stars Antonio Sabato Jr., the underwear model, if you remember him. And he plays a surgeon, which was really great casting. And I remember there was a scene in the movie, and I'm sitting there watching it with my dad, and Antonio Sabato Jr. is leaning over a patient's chest, and he goes, "We've got a subdural hematoma." And my dad looks at me and goes, "You know that's in the head, right?" So, I learned my first rule that the writer on a movie set is the lowest of the low. I actually had less power than the caterer. I remember I couldn't even get into the wrap party of my own TV movie unless I said I was part of Antonio Sabato Jr.'s entourage. So those were the lessons I was learning, and that's the stuff I was writing. I started hanging out in a bar in Boston, and this bar was called Crossroads, and it was your average kind of dive bar, except for it was right next to the school MIT, where all the geeky science guys were. And there was a group of college students who hung out there, and they looked like every other MIT kid, except for they had tons of money, and it was always in $100 bills. And in Boston, you never see $100 bills. I don't know about where you guys are from. In New York, sometimes you see $100 bills. In Vegas, they come out of the ATM machines. But in Boston, you never see big bills. And so I went up to the main kid, and I was like, "Why do you have so much money, and why is it in hundreds?" So he invites me to his house, and I get there, and stacked in his laundry was $250,000 in banded stacks of $100 bills. And I said, okay, this kid's got to be a drug dealer, right? But he was this smart math science kid. He just didn't look like a drug dealer. So I said, "Why do you have $250,000 in your laundry?" And he invited me to Vegas. So the next day, I got on a plane with him and 5 of his buddies, and they were all sitting in separate seats, and they were all pretending that they didn't know each other. And we landed in Las Vegas, and there was a uniformed driver in a big stretch limo. He picked us up. He brings us to this huge suite with a swimming pool. We had a butler. We didn't even know what to do with it, but we had a butler. And all the MIT kids, they start coming into the room, and they start pulling money out from under their clothes. And they had flown with $1 million in cash, had spread it out among them, flown to Vegas. They piled it up on the table in the suite, and they said, "We're the MIT blackjack team." Now, I had heard of something called the blackjack team when I was, in Boston, but I thought it was like a math club where they learned how to play blackjack. But the reality was, this had been going on for 25 years. These kids had made about $6 million beating Vegas. These secrets of blackjack had been handed down from group of students to group of students for 25 years. So I realized this was better than all the crap that I was writing. It just happened to be true. So I joined the MIT blackjack team. I started going to Vegas every weekend, and I wrote the story that became the movie 21, the Vegas movie, which a lot of you have probably seen. And it was, a wild story. These kids would spread out across the casino, one kid sitting at each table. They would signal in a guy called the big player who would be acting like a rich drunk guy who'd have money hanging out of his clothes. He'd smell like alcohol. He'd be betting big. And they were beating the casino by keeping track of the high and low cards. It's actually a very simple system, which I won't go into now, but afterwards we can hit the casino and I'll show you exactly how to do it until we get kicked out and arrested. But it's really actually not illegal. Although in Vegas, if you get caught doing it, they will take you to a back room. And if you go in the back room, it's really bad and scary. Although they don't actually beat you up like they do in the movie, but they make you stand against the wall. I'm not going to go into how I know this, but I do know this. So anyways, that system worked for a while. They made a ton of money. And I wrote the story, and I was sitting at home, and the book was about to come out, and the phone rings, and it's Kevin Spacey, the actor. And at first, I didn't believe it was Kevin Spacey. I actually hung up on him, and I called my mom, and I said, I think Kevin Spacey's trying to call me. She said, no, it's those MIT kids prank calling you, because they used to prank call me all the time. But it actually was Kevin, and he said, I want to make a movie out of this. So I said, sure. So we took it out to all the Hollywood movie studios, and they all turned it down, except for MGM, which coincidentally was the casino that we had been hitting over the past 2 years. So my first thought is, they're going to buy it and then they're going to make it disappear. So I met with the heads of MGM and they said, no, we love this movie because it makes people think they can beat Vegas. The reality is you have to practice 6 months. You spend 4 hours a day in secret classrooms. I always see people reading that book on the way to Vegas, which is the worst time to read that book. And you hit Vegas thinking you're going to win, but the reality is it's very difficult to do. But anyways, the movie was about to come out and I'm sitting at home and an email comes in to my website. 2 in the morning, it's from a college kid at Harvard. And he says, my best friend co-founded Facebook and no one's ever heard of him. And that's a weird email to get. I get weird emails all the time, but that was a weird email. I knew what Facebook was. Like everyone else, I was on Facebook, mainly because my wife is obsessed with Facebook, and so I wanted to see what pictures she was posting and if there was anything embarrassing that I needed to tell her to take down. And you see the parties that you didn't go to, and suddenly friends pop up and want to friend you, and people you haven't seen since high school because you didn't want to see them since high school are suddenly trying to be your friend. But it was interesting enough to make me go for a drink with this guy. So I sit down, and in walks Eduardo Saverin. And Eduardo was angry, really, really angry. He was also a little drunk, but he was angry. And he wanted to tell me about Mark Zuckerberg and how Mark Zuckerberg had screwed him. And that's how he started the conversation. He was very upset. He felt that he had co-founded Facebook with his best friend, and then his best friend had kicked him out of the company. And I thought, okay, this is kind of cool. I knew nothing about Facebook, knew nothing about how it started, so I started to hang out with him. And the story he told me, and a lot of you have seen The Social Network, but it was a really wild story. These two were geeky kids. They were outsiders. They were math science geeks. Eduardo had made a bunch of money because he was obsessed with meteorology and weather, and he had made all this money trading oil futures, following weather patterns, and Mark was a hacker. I mean, these were your ultimate geeky kids, just like the MIT kids I had written about in Vegas. And they wanted to be parts of these finals clubs. Eduardo really wanted to be a member of one of these secret societies at Harvard, the finals clubs. They're kind of these social institutions. Mark wasn't able to get in as well. And late one night after a really bad date, Mark came home, was drinking some beers, hacked into all the computers at Harvard, pulled up pictures of every girl on campus, and made a website where you could vote on who the hottest girl at Harvard was. And he emailed it to a couple of friends. It was just a joke. It ends up spreading all over campus. Everyone tries to log in at the same time. It crashes the computer servers at Harvard, and Mark gets in a lot of trouble. And he didn't even know why he was in trouble. To him, it wasn't a misogynistic thing. He didn't do anything. It was just kind of to show you what he could do. But Harvard was very upset at him, and they nearly kicked him out. At the same time, he caught the attention of the Winklevi, the Winklevoss twins. You could not invent these guys if you were in the Hollywood movie-making machinery. These guys, 6'5", identical twin Olympic rowers. They look like robots. They're really good looking. They were the cool kids on campus. I remember the first time I met them, I went into the room and they sit me down. They're like, so you look at us and you immediately think we're the bad guys, right? I was like, well, yeah, you guys do look like the bad guys. And they said, well, if this were an 80s movie, we would be chasing the Karate Kid around the room dressed as skeletons, right, like in the movie. I remember I put that in the book, and then Aaron Sorkin put that in the movie, and then Ralph Macchio called me, the original Karate Kid, to say how much he loved we were bringing back the Karate Kid, so that was cool. But the Winklevi, they needed a geek. They needed a nerd, because they were working on their own website, which was kind of a dating website. It was called the Harvard Connection. It was a way for girls to meet Harvard men. Harvard men spend a lot of time thinking about ways to help girls meet them. And this was this was the Winklevie's, brilliant idea. And so they hired Mark to be their geek. Mark didn't think much of their idea. He was just hanging out with the cool kids on campus. He essentially blew them off. He went to his friend Eduardo, and he said, listen, I got an idea for a website. Girls can put their own pictures up. People will put their own pictures up. I won't get in trouble. It's going to be this great idea. You put up $1,000. You can have 30% of the company. You'll be the CFO. Now remember, these are just two college kids in a dorm room. It's not businessmen. There's no lawyers. They're not thinking about this billion-dollar monster that it's going to become. They're just two kids coming up with an idea. Eduardo's like, sure, here's $1,000. Let's make this website. Mark makes the website. He runs off. He forgets about the Winklevie. He blows them off in emails. He creates Facebook. It launches. It takes over Harvard in like a week. Suddenly, everybody's on Facebook. Within a few months, it's getting close to 1 million members. It spreads from college to college. It's exclusive. It's brilliant. Everyone loves Facebook. It's better than MySpace. It's better than Friendster. Everyone's joining. At this point, they catch the attention of Sean Parker. Sean Parker, Justin Timberlake played him perfectly in the movie. Sean's the wild man. He's the cool kid, He's the one who dresses, really, really cool. He's got girls on his arms. He looks like he's on cocaine, although he's not actually on cocaine. He carries an EpiPen and an inhaler everywhere because he's actually really a geek. But he had been, he co-founded Napster, and then that had gotten, destroyed by the record companies. He created Plaxo and had gotten kicked out of that with some drug rumors involved. And he becomes this first CEO of Facebook. Mark basically idolizes him. They don't need Eduardo anymore. Eduardo starts to feel like he's being left behind. He gets so upset that he freezes the bank accounts of Facebook. It's his money at this point. He freezes the bank accounts. This really pisses Mark and Sean off, and they essentially cut him out of the company. And this is where it gets tricky, and you can see the movie and read the law documents. From Eduardo's point of view, he shows up to a meeting. He signs some papers in front of lawyers that he thinks are his lawyers. They're actually Facebook's lawyers. The papers he signs dilute him to about 0 of the company. They leave Mark and Sean with 7% and 30% of the company. And Eduardo gets really, really pissed off, and he sues his best friend. The Winklevosses are really, really pissed off. They sue Mark. Everybody sues Mark. That's what happens in written life pretty much every week. But anyways, Eduardo tells me this story. I'm blown away by it. I write a 14-page book proposal. I'm about to send it out, and it leaks onto the web on a site called Gawker.com. They print my entire book proposal. I've never seen this before. Suddenly, everything explodes. Facebook gets really, really pissed off. I think there's some people here from Facebook, and they might hate me. But Facebook gets really, really pissed off. I get all these phone calls. What are you doing? I spend a year trying to talk to Mark. Mark will not talk to me. I'm trying to talk to him. He knows I'm talking to Eduardo. He just doesn't want me telling his story. This is not the story he ever wanted to tell, and I understand that. This story is a lot from Eduardo's point of view. It's a lot from the Winklevosses, who Mark wishes didn't exist at all. But the reality is this is the story from one side in a lot of ways, and then it becomes Mark's story as we built the movie. But anyways, Mark won't talk to me. Eduardo freaks out because he's in the midst of this lawsuit with Facebook, realizes suddenly everyone knows he's talking to me, cuts off all communications with me, sends a letter from his lawyer, basically a restraining order. I'm no longer allowed to talk to Eduardo, and I've never spoken to Eduardo since. I, meanwhile, have to find all the other sources. I start hanging with the Winklevie. I start hanging with all the other different people. And then we take the book, and it basically spreads out, and Aaron Sorkin sees it. Aaron Sorkin says, I want to make a movie out of this. He comes to Boston. We sit in a hotel room. Aaron had never seen Facebook. He didn't even know what a Mac Air was when I met him. He actually didn't know how to hook an Ethernet port into anything, so he knew nothing about it. But what his idea was, which I thought was brilliant, is it didn't have to be Facebook. This was really a story about entrepreneurship, about a bunch of kids in a college setting who build something great. And the movie The Social Network, I think, captured that. It could have been about anything in this sort of modern time, about anything in this current revolution. And I always look back at this, and I'm always asked this, two college kids in a dorm room. And I talk to entrepreneurs this all the time. I talk to venture capitalists. Two best friends in a dorm room. You come up with an idea. You say, I'll get 50%, you'll get 50%, and then you go off and you build the company. You spend 3 years building it. It becomes this incredible thing. It's suddenly worth billions of dollars. And then your best friend comes back to you and says, okay, I want my 50%. Well, what does he deserve? And when you ask entrepreneurs that, they basically say he deserves nothing. He didn't do anything. But when you ask venture capitalists that, they say he deserves 50%. So that really is the difference of how these things happen. The movie came out and everybody loved it, except for the Academy. But it did what it should, and I think it really tells the story of two best friends torn apart by a billion-dollar business. And at this point, I think I'm going to answer questions in a little bit, but I want to thank you all very much, and I'll be able to talk about anything you want when we do the questions. Thank you.